We are live. Hi, everybody. I'm John Schnocky. Eleanor, would you like
Excellent.
to introduce yourself?
Sorry, I missed my cue.
Oh,
And I'm
oh, that's
Eleanor
fine.
Millman.
So we're here representing Sonobuoy. I am the kind of main engineer working on Sonobuoy right now. And so we want to go through today and talk about the project, what we do, how you can use it, and then kind of where we might go from there. One of the big things we're going to do during today is we're going to make our own little testing plugin. Hopefully, that will inspire people to use Sonobuoy to integrate their own tests. But we'll get more into that. Eleanor, you want to say a little bit more about yourself?
Sure thing. And I'm a product manager at VMware, and one of the areas I product manage is Sonobuoy. So John and I and another engineer, Vladimir, had a fun time thinking about Sonobuoy the last few months. Last few months for me, much longer for John and Vlad. And so we'll maybe chat a little bit about that later. So back to you, John.
Hey, Waleed from the eastern province of Saudi. This is one of the cool things whenever being on TGIK, seeing people from all over the world, legitimately, right? We sometimes are in this little bubble or kind of imagine people being in a small bubble, but it really is global. Finland, Amsterdam. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I am in the southern United States. I'm in Louisiana.
Yeah, and I usually am in Toronto, but I'm in Connecticut right now. And I'm at my parents' house, and they have a very odd sense of decor. So
the fish are perfect.
Well, Sonobuoy, or rather, Kubernetes has such a nautical theme. So let's say I picked it for that.
Perfect. Yeah, that's Sonobuoy themed. Vladimir's in the chat. Hey, Vlad. Vlad also works on the Sonobuoy project. He's taking a break and working on some other things right now, but nice of him to join us still. Hi from Poland. Hi, John. Yeah, Waleed wishes Vladimir were on this side. We can always invite you if you want to ping us. We'll give you an invite. But okay, we'll go ahead and start going through the week in review. Let's see. Change this. Eleanor, or no, I didn't share my screen yet. Let me add that back. Infinite, perfect, just the way it should be. All right. So, Eleanor, you see now the shared screen, the notes from the HackMD.
Well, I'm seeing the yeah, exactly.
Okay, perfect. So, kind of a short week in review. So, a few things that stuck out to me. One was a message about the Kubernetes deprecation policy was changing, but it was emphasized in the message that it was more of a clarification than a real change to how it was actually being implemented. So, I linked the PR there, anybody who's interested, but what they emphasize is that they are not going to be removing generally available API endpoints within a major release. So they never really planned on doing that. I think they said they had never done that before, but the policy was written in a vague sort of way to where they just said, as long as it's been a year, we might remove something. So they just wanted to make sure that people understood the stability promise that they're not going to be removing generally available endpoints. So that's definitely noteworthy if you've ever been worried about that.
Wait, and I am much newer to Kubernetes than John. I've been doing Kubernetes for a year-ish, but only data protection mostly. So question. So when we say the API endpoints, first of all, we're talking about like the declarative Kubernetes API where you create like a resource to make something happen. Is that what we're talking about? Or are we talking about some kind of REST API that has endpoints?
Well, so the Kubernetes API is really big, but so there's whole classes of endpoints, but some of those classes, right? If you look in the path of the URL for the API endpoint, it'll say something like v1 beta 1 slash, some pod rotation object. So as that feature, whatever it is, goes on in life and gets more testing, more people see that like this is going into all the clusters. We're going to put this as part of Conformance. It'll evolve through that beta or from alpha then to beta, and then eventually it'll change that pathing to where it'll be a generally available endpoint at some other API group.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Mostly. I'm used to think of Kubernetes APIs as like custom resources or like creating a resource, like that kind of declarative API. But it sounds like when you're talking about like with the path, it sounds more REST-like. So I'm trying to, I'm even asking a more basic question than you think I'm asking.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, so when you think about like I mean, I guess the declarative of saying there is a job, but right when you go and query like pods, right,
Mhm.
that's maybe in the core group, so it's just like slash pods. But
Oh, you
a
mean
lot of
for
the
the
other
API
ones,
server?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah, against the API server.
so this is like hitting the API. Okay, okay.
Yeah, so
Thank
those
you.
sorts of things that, and it comes up especially in some of these projects where you're vendoring the libraries for like client Go against a certain version. And it'd be nice to know that if you're using generally available endpoints, that you're not going to have to, go back and update those because somebody removed a GA endpoint.
That makes sense. Okay, thank
Uh,
you.
no problem. Then the other thing we have here, I saw this was from the CNCF blog, a policy management paper. This was put out by the Security Special Interest Group, the SIG, and the Policy Working Group. Open that up. So yeah, this is more or less the high level overview of it, but just kind of talking about the importance of policy. They say they go over a bunch of different use cases when you might want to use policy, the approaches you might use. Um, but let me see. Not the link. Oh, okay. I didn't realize that was in GitHub. I had scrolled down before and I thought it looked like a nice little white page, white paper website, but it's all in GitHub. So yeah, so anybody who's interested can go through, but especially if it's got the SIG and the working group both being behind it, you know that you're getting the best level of information. Okay, any questions? We can go ahead
Yeah,
and
I was just
go.
looking at the
Yeah.
chat a little bit, more hellos, another Netherlands and others. And thank you. I got a call out on my fish. I appreciate that. A shout out.
Thank you, Eleanor, for watching the chat. I'm really hesitant to keep going back to the StreamYard because that's going to throw the infinite loop back.
I'll make
But
a deal with you. John, ask me every so often to check this Slack, the chat if I'm forgetting, and I'll report back to you.
okay. Otherwise, yeah, we can go ahead and start with the introduction to Sonobuoy here. So there's a website that we host all our docs and our blog from, sonobuoy.io. If you scroll down to, you can go straight to the GitHub. As a developer, right? That's where I mainly go. But really, all the docs, even from this README, are available through. If we scroll all the way up here, the documentation. So the main way that people really know Sonobuoy, because you may have heard it if you're in the Kubernetes world, is that Sonobuoy is the recommended tool from the CNCF to run the Kubernetes conformance tests. So if something says like it's certified Kubernetes, you have to submit the results of these end-to-end tests that Kubernetes maintains. Sonobuoy doesn't maintain those tests, but you submit these test results. Running those tests can be complicated if you just have to start from the source code in the Kubernetes repo. So they made, they containerize it all. There's a couple different ways to run them. The CNCF recommends Sonobuoy just, I think, because it's so simple to run. And that's really what we see as Sonobuoy's value proposition, is that it's really easy, really easy to integrate into your CI system. And then as we'll talk about it, you can actually run more than just the end-to-end tests. And I know towards the end, if we go over to the show notes, we're going to talk about like running these end-to-end tests, but eventually we're going to talk about making our own plugin. So how can you still leverage a bunch of the nice things about Sonobuoy, but run your own tests? And we're going to talk about some future ideas. And this is really where I'll definitely hand over to you, Eleanor, to talk
Yeah.
more about our strategy document and how we might use those.
And just to give you a teaser now, so as you're kind of seeing the tech, you can be thinking about how to extend it. As John has said, exactly, like Sonobuoy is so solid, stable running the conformance test, but John and Vlad already did a lot of work to maybe make it easier for others to make plugins, and folks have started to develop other uses. And the more we thought about it, the more we realized like automated cluster validation, there's so many use cases. For example, you're a support engineer and you want to make a really quick initial diagnosis of what's wrong with the cluster. You can run a suite of tests, basically the conformance test, and say, networking is broken because the networking tests are failing. Or maybe you've done a restore, you've done a backup, then you restore something. How the heck do you know if what you restored is working? You could use automated tests to see whether things are functioning as it should. So I will stop there, but we'll talk more about it later, but just as you're listening, think about how you could validate things in your own cluster.
Yeah, and as we'll see with going through the demo of running the E2E tests, one of the big values of Sonobuoy is just that kind of you can leverage all the UI and results reporting structure that's already there. So if you already have it in your CI system to run these certified Kubernetes tests to make sure your cluster is operating the right way, you can change just one line in your scripts and you can potentially be testing, you know, 2, 3, 4 other test suites at the same time. Some of them are maybe proprietary closed source things that you developed. Maybe other ones are open source plugins. There's a few, we can go over those towards the end. I mean, we have a Sonobuoy's plugin repo. Some of them are security based, some of them are performance based. And anything that you can write, you know, if you can containerize it, Sonobuoy can run it. So that's kind of the
Pardon
idea.
me, John. Someone asked for the URL, and I knew that you knew it by heart. It's for the
For the
notes.
plugins or for what?
So I'm so sorry. URL for the show notes.
Oh, for the show notes. Yeah, sorry about that. So I don't think the TGIK show notes, the latest one updated. So it's tgik.io/notes. So here, if you can see me type it, notes-183. So I think if you just go to notes, it should be the latest, but I think we forgot to update that. So it'll be -183.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go over to my terminal just to start. We're going to clear this. So Sonobuoy at its heart is just, or here, before we go to the CLI, how about we do this? We have a nifty little diagram about how Sonobuoy works before we jump back to the code level. So really, if you go to the Sonobuoy repo, the main thing you'll see there is code for a CLI. Everything, even the containerized parts, are really just powered by the same CLI, Sonobuoy. So from your local machine, one of the main commands you'll do is Sonobuoy run, right? Run a plugin. That's how we describe it. When you say to run a plugin, it's going to leverage your kubeconfig file locally to talk to your cluster. So you don't have to give Sonobuoy any extra permissions or anything like that. You don't have to tell it where your cluster is. It's just going to be looking at what your current targeted cluster is through that kubeconfig. Then it will launch an aggregator pod. This is, when it's launched, the name of it is just Sonobuoy. This is the thing that's going to gather up all the results from whatever you decide to test. Because like I said, you can test multiple test suites all at the same time. You can be gathered, by default, we gather logs from the nodes themselves, and we run the E2E test suite. So, you know, the aggregator then launches all the plugins, and we have this little worker here sitting next to it that's also Sonobuoy, just running in a different mode. It's the same Sonobuoy CLI though, but it's working with this plugin to communicate those results back to the aggregator. And then from your side, all the way at the client side, you can use other commands, and we'll see that, how to get those results back out.
And
So
John,
that's the idea. Okay.
sorry, did I cut you off?
No, you're good.
So I know you've told me, but I want to review. I want to make sure of it. So the aggregator is one pod, and and the plugin plus worker is in another pod, and the plugin, the worker, each containers. Like the workers maybe like a sidecar, or
Yeah, that's the pattern that we use. So it's considered a sidecar. So your plugin definition is really just a YAML file that tells us what image to run as a container, how to run it, what are some, you know, pod requirements you want. We take that and then we inject our own little Sonobuoy sidecar so that it will redirect the results to the aggregator. So each individual plugin doesn't have to do that. There's a very small interface between the plugin and the worker, and we'll get to that a little bit later when we talk about building a plugin. But yeah, so the aggregator is one pod, and then this gray box here around the plugin worker, each one of those is another pod. And you can have plugins that are actually daemon sets, so you can have them run on every node. For instance, if you want to gather, you know, node level logs, you can do that. As here, it just looks, you know, a single pod, but it could be a single pod over every single node. Okay. So now let's pull this up. Let's actually see it in action a little bit. So if we do Sonobuoy run, what this is going to do is run the default conformance suite. There's actually a few tests in the upstream that are a little bit destructive to production clusters. So we remove those tests. So by default, you're not going to do anything destructive, but there's a couple hundred tests and it take like an hour to run. So we're going to do something a little bit faster. We're going to say, we're going to add this mode flag and just say quick. Okay, so this is going to say that it's going to run a single test from the end-to-end test suite. Okay, and normally, because it's Kubernetes, everything is done asynchronously. So if you launch this right now as written, it'll say it created a bunch of stuff and then be done. And you can do other things on your terminal. Most of the time, at least in my experience, when you're doing these sorts of things in CI or even just locally, you usually want to do it synchronously. So we added a wait flag here so that it'll, I was testing this and apparently left that. So we're going to have to delete this cluster or delete the namespace. Okay. You get to see another command in the meantime. So deleting is the same way, right? Normally when you try and delete a namespace or a pod, it all happens asynchronously. We don't want to continue until it's done. So as it's waiting, it's going to be sending out a bunch of information just so you can kind of get a sense, are things progressing? Especially namespaces have a tendency to get stuck deleting. I don't really know why that is. I think there have been a number of issues about why namespaces take so long to delete. If anybody in the comments has an idea.
Yeah, I was going to ask. That was definitely going to be my question. I've never heard that before. Ah.
Yeah, there's sometimes, so I'm using a kind cluster. That's kind of what we recommend for local development. And there's times when a namespace just will not delete. What it is these finalizers. You can look through this JSON and you can see there's certain finalizers. It's waiting for just something, it's a series of dominoes and one of those dominoes just got missed. And so the whole thing can halt. The
What
easiest
are finalizers?
solution.
Are they resources or no?
God, it's been a while since I've looked into it. It's like saying like we're waiting on this to be deleted. And then it's waiting for like its status to be updated to say it had been deleted. So it's a description of what it's waiting for, and sometimes that gets out of sync with the actual state of the cluster. I think that's what's going on. On a low level, I've fixed it before and fixed a hung namespace, but it is a pain in the butt. And the easiest thing is usually just to delete your cluster and start over if it's just a testing cluster.
That sounds like a pain. Waleed, by the way, agreed. He said it's the finalizer. Some resource is still in there. So thank you.
So now we're going to go back. We're going to run in quick mode. So we're just running one test and we're saying to wait. One of the improvements we made lately, it used to be that it would just sit here and wait. But a lot of people would say, is it hanging? Is it sitting there for an hour? Is it done? Is it progressing at all? So we added more feedback, just like in the delete. You got to see the actual JSON. Here we have different, more user-friendly input or output. You can see we're running a systemd logs plugin, and we're running the E2E plugin. And every, I think it's 20 seconds, we update this and we check if the status changed. So then you can see some of these are completed. The E2E plugin is now reporting some amount of progress. It knows it's going to run one test. 0 of them have been completed so far, though. And while that's happening here, I'm going to open it, but now it's already done. It's the one problem. It's a little too fast. While things are running, though, you can also, I'm going to open up a new tab. So you can do like Sonobuoy status at any point. If you cut off that command in the first place so that you're not waiting on it anymore, you can always just do Sonobuoy status and get that same information. And the super pro tip, if you add the JSON flag here, I'm going to pipe this through JQ so it's nicer to read. You can get a little bit of extra information, especially if there's like test failures. So all the progress messages for the plugin are here. So it'll list how many tests have completed, what the last message was. And if there's a list of failures, you can sometimes start debugging the failures before the test run is done. I find that particularly useful, but a lot of people don't know you can check the JSON. Okay, so Sonobuoy tries to direct you, says now that the run's complete, you can do Sonobuoy retrieve. That's for the full results tarball. So Sonobuoy, let's do this. Retrieve. Retrieve itself has a bunch of options. if you just do retrieve, here we'll do, if you just do retrieve, it's going to download to, a time-stamped tarball. You can capture that, or you can just refer to it if you want copy paste, but you can also specify like what file you want it to be. Tarbar's easy. Or this is maybe my favorite one, is you can just extract everything yourself. So it's going to download the tarball and extract it into the output folder.
And John, just orient myself again. So the workers, the plugin and the workers were running, they completed the test, they reported to the aggregator created the tarball, and now when we do retrieve, we're asking the aggregator to send it to us?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is one thing with Sonobuoy. Sonobuoy itself doesn't have like an API it exposes. And that's really for the security concerns. We don't want to have to worry about authentication in any other way. So the only way that the CLI is operating with the aggregator is just through the Kubernetes API itself. So all this status message, that's not coming from, some like aggregator exposed endpoint. That's actually on the pod itself. So the aggregator is updating its own metadata as we go. So let's see, key control get pods and Sonobuoy. And you can always bounce back and forth between kube control and Sonobuoy for some more advanced debugging. But so if we do this and we do out YAML, we scroll up, we should see.
And this is the aggregator showing me you're like showing me the aggregator pod, I guess.
Yes, yeah. So you can see, we have some labels here showing that it is the aggregator. All these things about progress and the status are just annotations on the pod. But it's doing that. So the worker is getting that information and then securely talking to the aggregator. They agree on like a key, and so it's all HTTPS, I think, while it's in the cluster. But other than that, once exposed out into the cluster, it's just through the normal Kubernetes API. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and just that the download then, what is the download though? Wouldn't that need an API? I mean, wouldn't that need like a endpoint?
Yeah, there is a Kubernetes API endpoint that allows you, I think, to like run remote commands. I think that's what it is. And so what you're doing is you're like telling it to run a tar command that just spits out the tar data of this file that you expect to be there.
Cool.
And so yeah, so you kind of get away with a little nifty bit of cheating there.
Great.
So once you have, we have that what was it, output.tar or out.tar. Okay. So if you have that tarball, you could open it up and explore. There's tons of data in there, but you don't have to do that. You can also, if you just hand that tarball to a coworker or you're looking at it in your CI system, you can do Sonobuoy Results. And it will automatically look into the tarball and see what's going on. So at least as far as the plugins are concerned, we actually have an open issue about, can we surface some more useful information here? Especially it would be useful in like a broken cluster situation to know, was the API server responding? Were these nodes responding? Are there failed pods? But here you can see the E2E plugin ran, it passed. There was one test that passed. All these other 5,666 were skipped. We actually have a blog post on this with Sonobuoy because that was one of our most common questions. Why are there so many tests skipped? Even when you do the full conformance suite, you run 300 or so, but you still skip 5,200, 5,400. And that's just because so many of these tests are like feature specific. They're not related to how you expect every cluster to behave. You can always run those. You could always specify what you want to run. In Sonobuoy run, we have special flags for E2E focus and E2E skip. These are regular expressions. You can choose what test specifically you want to run. That's really useful if you are, say, testing just networking stuff or just net storage stuff with a certain provider. I don't want to get too advanced right here, but the question, as soon as we tell people about the focus and the skip, the question is, what do I put for that focus value, right? If there's 5,000 tests, how do I know what values I can choose from? So we just added an E2E command, which is a way to get those test lists. And it's checking what version of Kubernetes I have, because these test lists change every version. And in default, it will just spit out the test list. You could scan through that, but there's a lot of data there. So you can also do this mode. So what this does is it looks at all those test lists, and then these bracketed names, this is just convention with the upstream Kubernetes community. They put all these tags, these just words in brackets, to try and categorize their tests. So, they have a whole node conformance suite. Some tests check privileged behavior. SIGs have their own tags. So you can play with this, though. The nice thing about the E2E mode, if you are really trying to figure out what you or your company wants to test, you can double check that these things look right, because you can say focus, let's say conformance. If I'm going to focus on conformance, now let's actually see what I'm going to hit. You can see some conformance tests are marked as disruptive, some are Linux only, some are slow. So you can kind of refine what test groups you want by doing this, because you can then start doing things. Sorry, this little stuff's in the way from StreamYard. So you can say skip disruptive. Now, if I skip disruptive and choose conformance test, these are the tags I would get. And you can, play with that around. There's also a tag counts. So you can see not only what tags you hit, but how many times it occurred. So for instance, let's go back up. You can see there's 2 disruptive tests if you check for conformance. You do have to kind of be careful here because of the brackets. Node conformance also happens to have, that word in it. Be careful with your regexes. Yeah, you can tinker with that. That's a really fun command to tinker with when you're working out. It used to be you could do similar things. Yeah, there's 2 of them now. The reason I was curious was I thought there was only one test that did that. But it used to be you could get this information, but you had to run a whole run. You had to run something in dry run mode. You had to parse the JUnit results. It was a big pain in the butt. So our hope is that this makes things a lot easier. Try it out. Let us know what you think. If there's other ways to improve it, we definitely would like to add those.
And dare I say, of course, with a new feature, we're kind of playing around. We're working with a support team to try to figure out ways to help them with that support diagnosis use case. And John has done an excellent job of making a POC. Here's something to try it out. But of course, if folks are using it and you have a UI request, if there are users using it for specific use cases, we're delighted to tweak the UI if it makes it easier to use.
Yeah, absolutely. We were trying to solve a problem, and I'm a Sonobuoy dev now, but before I worked directly on Sonobuoy, I was just on a team at another company using Sonobuoy to try and run all these conformance tests constantly. So I do at least understand some of those concerns about trying to run things faster, trying to get the results out in a predictable way. So we've tried to add those things over the last couple of years. Always room for improvement, though. Well, speaking of those improvements, if you are using Sonobuoy in a CLI setting where you want to know if you're passing conformance, but you're not trying to get certified Kubernetes, you kind of are being resource conscious, we just added a new mode in here. There's actually a Sonobuoy modes command now too. If you're curious what those modes mean, Sonobuoy mode spits out all that data. So first, let's look here. This is what we just ran. Quick mode runs a single test to create and destroy the pod. Fastest way to check basic cluster operation. And you can see it focuses on just one test, doesn't provide a skip, and it's not run in parallel. The default here is it's non-disruptive conformance. So we exclude a couple tests, but otherwise we're just focusing on conformance tests. And they are run in series because there are some tests that have to be run in series there. But we just added this one, this conformance light, excuse me. And the focus, conformance. Oh, so we're running all the conformance tests, but we skip a whole bunch of tests. It's truncated here. There's a verbose flag, but we're skipping like 30 tests, and we have to just specify them by name. But the cool thing about this, you get about 80% of the conformance tests, and they're all run in parallel, and we chose the fastest test. So in the happy path, if you're running this in CI and you expect it to pass, but you still want to run it, you can get, instead of like a 30-minute to an hour run, it's like 6 minutes is what I had locally. So this can be really useful, I think, for saving people some CI time.
Let's just pause for a second. We actually have a question whether Sonobuoy can be used with AWS's EKS or Azure AKS, etc. I believe the answer is yes, right? Sonobuoy will run on any functional Kubernetes cluster, and in fact, I suspect EKS and AKS use Sonobuoy to confirm that they are conformant, right?
Yeah,
Am I on the ball? Or?
Pretty close. So it definitely can run on all these different platforms. Sometimes there's a known issue. So like on Google Cloud Platform, there was like a role binding that's just not present. We just tell you how to resolve that. If you find a problem with a particular provider, let us know. So there was an issue with running on Docker Desktop because of the way Docker Desktop works. But otherwise, all the other cloud providers it works for. And that was a great comment you made about CNCF certified Kubernetes. Let me look at that. CNCF certified Kubernetes. Because I definitely didn't know this, but all of that certification results is all open source. You can go and look at those. Look, GitHub. It's all hosted on a GitHub repo. Might be this. Yeah, so if you go to the CNCF organization of K8's Conformance, you can look at who is certified Kubernetes and for what version, right? As Kubernetes changes, you have to get recertified. So you can look at things like, there's a whole lot of more people getting certified Kubernetes than you might know too. Let's go loop one farther back so that we have more people. Let's see. Gartner AWS, Giant Swarm AWS, Metacube AWS, and you can look in. So let's Metacube. I have no idea what Metacube is, but set up. They give instructions for how they set up their clusters, how they run the conformance tests. Yeah, so this person is using Sonobuoy. They're kind of doing it interestingly. They're pointing out the fact like the CLI is really for you as the user, at your local machine. But really what powers the run itself are the images that create those pods. So all of that's controlled by this, just a YAML file. You can actually see that if you do like Sonobuoy. Let's do, just like our command before, mode quick. But if we, instead of run, if we change this for gen, if you're ever curious what Sonobuoy is actually going to do, or you want to tweak it slightly, this outputs all that YAML. And so that's what they're doing. They're using Sonobuoy, but not the CLI. And you can, let's see, all the data about the plugins is here. So you can see like in quick mode, there's an environment variable set on that container for E2E focus, for which test to focus on. So, and there's a lot of extra information here. 99% of the time you don't need it. Some power user cases really do want to tweak something there. In the most common situations, though, we just add a CLI flag if it's really useful for enough people. But yeah, so people here are using Sonobuoy. You can check, there's a few other ways to run them. Typically, they are a little more low level because you have to get like the actual test binaries and manually put them into pods and do things, or load them onto the nodes. I think there's a few other things like kube test. I don't have a lot of experience. I know that Kubernetes test grid, I think, uses kube test a lot because kube test has some other functionality to create the test cluster, then run tests, then tear down the test cluster. Sonobuoy is just about getting those results and trying to make things really easy to integrate with other systems and other plugins.
By the way, Waleed had a follow-up comment. For worker nodes application tests, like things should be fine. I think his point, I guess you help me understand. I think the point is like the Google thing, it was like a permissions issue, but in general, well, I don't know. I'll let you.
Yeah, I mean, once you have a cluster, right, part of the promise of Kubernetes, right, is that you're going to become cloud agnostic, that you just are going to, know what to expect from any Kubernetes cluster. And that's the idea of what conformance is you have this minimum baseline of everyone should agree that if it's AWS or it's GCE or it's GCP, if you're conformant, you should be able to know these features work. And as long as you can create pods, you can run Sonobuoy. And then as long as you can run Sonobuoy, we can tell you what other things are working and if it's conformant or not. I think that answers the question. Tell me if I'm missing any part of it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I think
No.
it's good. Thank you.
Okay. Here, so let's see. I've lost a little track. So we saw while a test was running, you could see progress messages. Like I said, here we had a happy path, nothing was failing. But that the progress was really useful because of the fact, like I said, a full conformance run can take an hour. If you have a large cluster, it can take longer than that. So it's really nice to see whether or not you're having failures as you go. That was something that was added close to maybe about a year ago. Oh, I will say, while something's running, there's also a logs command. So you can do, let's do this. You can launch Sonobuoy into other namespaces too. So I'm not going to do a delete here. I'm going to say like Sonobuoy run. I'm going to do the full conformance run, but I'm going to run it in another namespace called full conformance. I'm going to run it asynchronously. So it just launches all the resources and throws me back to my terminal. But I can start doing things like Sonobuoy logs and see what's going on in the cluster. Oh, I need to say in the namespace full conformance. So you can see it's the pods or the logs from the Sonobuoy pod, the logs from the EDE pod. And you can, if you have a bunch of things running, you can clean this up a little bit by saying, I only want to look at the EDE plugin. So it'll only get those logs. So a lot of different things that help you debug as the tests are running. So if they are long running, it still doesn't have to be the end of the world. Okay. After completion, so we talked about status, we talked about retrieving and untarring everything, and the results command. Awesome. We're at about 37 minutes. I think we're doing great. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was actually just making our own plugin. Because, okay, now you've seen that there is, here, I'll even show this. There is a E to E plugin. And like I said, it's really just a YAML file, Sonobuoy gen plugin E to E. This allows you to just see what the actual E to E plugin looks like, right? There's some pod spec. We want to make sure to run on a Linux node. That's just a requirement of the E to E container. It's spitting out results in JUnit format. A lot of these things you don't have to worry about, but you can see the plugin is really a pod spec and a container spec that's telling you how to run it, and down here, the image. Okay. So now let's try to make our own using some helpful tools we've made. We're going to nuke this folder. Remove. Be very careful with that command. So nothing's in here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all the stuff from what we have in the Sonobuoy plugins repo. There's an example EDE skeleton. And again, it's early days on that. I want to make it better, but you can see that you get a bunch of stuff for free here. This temp file is just something locally that's junk. But otherwise, you get a Docker file because we have to have an image. You get a basic build script, right? If you're really developing something, you'll modify that. But this is a way to get, off the ground really, really fast. And you get a plugin.yaml file. That is a plugin specification. And then the actual Go code, right? So this is a plugin example for Go. We do have a plugin helper, and the skeleton is primarily around Go, since that's a lot of what the Kubernetes ecosystem uses. So let's open this up. So to start your own code from this, we only have to change a few tiny things. So like I said, we need to say what image to run. Let's say TGIK. That's what we're going to name our image. I'm going to say this is version 0.0.1. Plugin name, we're going to call it TGIK. That's really just for how we like it to look. Build, same thing here. Okay, so when building, it's just a Docker build and a Docker push. TGIK 0.0.1. Okay. Now and if you want to look at the Docker file, you can. It's adding a few useful things in here, depending on what your tests are. I added JQ, kube controls in there. You can do a lot of pretty powerful things with just having a basic plugin that has access to kube control, right? You can script all sorts of kube control commands, or you can be piping the actual JSON data through JQ and then, making decisions on that. But for the skeleton, we just start with a couple tests. And I will say this also now uses, I'll point out this, thanks to Vladimir, shout out to Vlad, for the SIGs or Kubernetes SIGs E2E framework. So this is, just like a lot of other testing frameworks, but it's focused on Kubernetes. So it's trying to make the things you need to do in Kubernetes easier. And personally, my favorite thing about it is getting a Kubernetes client really, really easy. So test main, if you know about Go testing, this isn't a test itself. It's just the stuff that kind of sets up all the tests. And we added some nice to have features here so that you get them automatically when you start your plugin. That includes progress through Sonobuoy, so that if you add a bunch of long tests or you have 100, 200 tests, you're going to get progress messages as they complete. That's definitely a nice to have. And then before each test, it's going to create a new namespace to launch pods into. And that way, your test can have a little more sandboxing. You might not need that. You can always delete that if that's not something you need. So if we look at the tests, we just have a couple of simple tests here. If you're running your own, you'd obviously just delete it. But you can see we're defining, we have this new feature. We're going to test pod listing from kube system, for instance. So this is what I'm talking about, getting the Kubernetes client for free. It's just so easy. You just, in this function, you happen to have a config object and you call client on it, automatically you have a Kubernetes client. So here we're going to be looking at resources and the kube system, and we're going to list a pod list, right? You just pass in the object itself that you're going to list. And here the test is just going to say, if we don't have any pods, we'll fail. Yeah, Eleanor's question.
Very basic question. So when you say Kubernetes client, is that basically like a little tunnel to the API server? So when you say like .resources, you're like, API server, tell me the resources in kube system?
Yes, absolutely. So, and there is a client Go, a library you can use to talk to the API server. If you've done a lot of projects using client Go, it's definitely doable and it's very strong client, but there's so many API endpoints. It can be a little frustrating and all the different versioning and all the different dependencies. And you have to set it up because it needs to know how to talk to the API server. If you can avoid it, like I appreciate how much easier this is. But yeah, it is just, it knows how to talk to the API server. So when you say resources and you pass a namespace, it knows what that URL should look like. That's kind of the point. And then you still get all this typed objects because we're creating and passing in the type. And so you don't have to do as much boilerplate API code. Just check, hey, is kube system non-empty? That's a reasonable test. Make sure that's running. You might also just test, hey, make sure none of those pods in kube system are in a failed state, right? Make sure they're all running. Those are all things you could do. You have the pod list now, just iterate over it however you want. And then we threw another test in here just as an example. Same sort of thing. We're going to pod list from kube system. Here, I wanted to make it a long test so that you can see you also have this progress reporter that you can pull out of a context that gets passed around. Every test has access. So if you have some useful helper object that you want for a test or a series of tests, you can always pass that in. Here, I'm using that to send async messages that just every 5 seconds mention, yeah, I'm still waiting. All right. But so all we've done, we edited the plugin.yaml. We really just changed the name, right? That's the only thing we did. But now if we do, we're going to have to delete Sonobuoy delete and Sonobuoy delete namespace. Oh, we'll leave that one running. Doesn't matter. Yeah. So we can use the default namespace here. Shouldn't take too long. While we're waiting for this to delete, any other questions in the chat or for you, Eleanor?
Sorry, I keep losing my mute button. Not for now. No.
Okay. Yeah, so hopefully what we'll see, and when we get the results from this custom plugin, I'll actually open it up and look at more of the data there so that you can see what Sonobuoy is doing and what it provides to you to help debug problems. Because that's really one of the hopes of Sonobuoy, is not just that we'll run your tests. That's part of the problem you need to solve, but run your tests. And then if there's a failure, how do you debug that? Especially if your failure is in the middle of the night last night, is the cluster still even alive? Maybe it got destroyed by CI. Sonobuoy, though, is constantly, it always gets more information so that in that tarball, you can actually debug the problem, even if the cluster doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't obviously have everything. You can't, you can configure it to get a lot more, but we'll see what they have. So we're going to do another
referencing the last little thing, and of course, Sonobuoy totally cleans itself up afterwards. It deletes all the namespaces. It deletes whatever it created to do testing, right? You have the destructive tests that are like, you can see things happen to your cluster, but beyond that, it doesn't touch anything.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll try to leave everything in place.
I should say. Sorry.
Yeah, it should leave it when you delete. It should delete everything. Now, it will be noteworthy. People have probably run into this before. This one's not a problem, right? I have a full conformance test, remember, running in the background. So if we do Sonobuoy status full conformance, you can see this is still running. I have 32 tests passing. So the end-to-end suite, if you're not familiar, since it's testing all this Kubernetes functionality, it creates and destroys tons of stuff, including namespaces, including cluster-wide resources. And it doesn't always do a great job of cleaning itself up or making sure these things are tied so the cascade or the deleting cascades. So Sonobuoy does provide a all flag here for delete. If you ever notice a bunch of namespaces that look like this hanging around after a bunch of test runs, it's just the end-to-end tests not cleaning themselves up. You can, for one, solve your own problem just by deleting all. If you realize that it's always happening in the same namespace or the same test or something like that, open up a ticket with the upstream Kubernetes, because they don't want that to be the case either. Not really sure why. There seems to be some leaking resources. But okay, so now we're going to try running our own custom plugin. Run, so we're going to say it would be -p or -- plugin. And we're just pointing to that YAML file. And the main thing the YAML file does is it tells what image to run and how to run it, like the container and the pod configuration. Excuse me, what's going on? Okay, so we're going to see status here pretty soon. I know I wrote it so that long test would slow things down, so we'll actually see some amount of progress here. I can pull this open too, though. Let's see. Sonobuoy logs. Oh, I didn't build the image. Oh, yeah, see, silly demo. Right, so it's saying it's running. It's going to be waiting for a while, and this would actually fail. But this is another area we want to improve things. If we enter an image error pull state, which is what we've done here, it would be nice to surface that information a little faster and a little bit better. So let's do this. Sonobuoy delete. So the full demo is, remember, we have this build script here. We have the Docker file, we have the plugin YAML, but we actually have to build the image. Build.sh. So it's a really simple Docker file otherwise, right? It's just building my Go code, throwing it in there. Okay, and so it pushes it. Docker, I think it's fine now. Docker was having a problem earlier, so I couldn't run demos. And in case people don't know, if you're using Kind, you can load images directly into your node, so you don't have to go through Docker. That can be really useful sometimes. So we're going to use that here. It usually goes pretty quick. And it shouldn't really matter now because it can pull from Docker Hub. Let's see. Yeah, we're going to let them pull. We're just going to end that. Useful trick if Docker Hub is down. You can still test things. And in CI, I wanted to point this out. In CI, you're going to want to do this because if you are, let's say the plugin is the thing you're testing, so you're constantly making new updates to it. when someone pushes a change, you don't want it to reference your old plugin that's already been pushed, to Docker Hub. You just build it locally in the CI system, load it into your kind cluster that's also in the CI system, and then run your test. And unless you set the image pull policy to always, it'll just use that one that's already pre-pulled onto the node. So that's how you can keep testing in CI without having to constantly put like dev tags on all your images. So, okay, so now we're going to run. And it's going to be giving us output here, but we can also check here. Logs, awesome. And you can see, so it pulled really fast. This is the output. If we scroll up, namespace Sonobuoy, pod, Sonobuoy TGIK job, and it has a UUID here. This is all the output from like go test. This is what it looks like when you do go test with that JSON flag. And Sonobuoy supports that type of output. So what the plugin is doing, it's running the go tests. It's outputting it to standard out so that we can see it here in the logs. But it's also saving it to a file which Sonobuoy will process as the results. So you can see some of these are saying it's starting to run a test. Some are just random output for the user. Then some are pass, and in theory, some could be failed. Let's see what it's looking like. So it completed, 0 failures. Now we can do Sonobuoy retrieve. I'm going to just extract everything into the output directory. So again, and this is what's nice with Sonobuoy, everything automatically integrates because from the point that it gave the results to the worker, Sonobuoy had control over it and could move the bits around in the right place. So if you do Sonobuoy retrieve tar.gz and Sonobuoy results, now it already is integrated into the CLI to where you can see how many tests, pass, failed. It gives you a list of failures there. And the same thing was true if you had done Sonobuoy status. We're going to pipe that through JSON and JQ. It's all here as well. So as it's running through either the status command or the results command, your CI system can hinge on whether or not it's seeing failures there or getting that list of failure and logging them. Okay, let's see. So in the output, in this directory, this is what a results tarball actually looks like. And the main data that you've seen so far is just in this plugins directory. We only ran one plugin, so there's a folder for TGIK, and there's a folder for global results, right? It just ran one plugin rather than per nodes. That's why it says global. The output is just all that JSON from go test. It lists the definition here. This is good to have, especially again, if you're handing this tarball to somebody and say, my plugin failed, what was the problem? They are going to ask questions like, well, how was the plugin configured? They can go through all of that. They can also, though, ask questions about what the status of the cluster was like, right? So that's where you can look at all this extra data here. You can see that I have information on all the nodes in the cluster. So the health and configuration of the control plane node, of the worker node, of the second worker node. There's also information about Sonobuoy itself, right? Its configuration, right? Because every Sonobuoy run, there's all sorts of knobs you can turn. Most of the time you don't need to, but especially with gathering all this data, there's different things you can gather. Plus, it'll tell you what images you were working with, what the pull policy was. Be careful with the image pull policy. That would be a pro tip as well. If you are iterating over and over on the same project, make sure if you're not bumping the tag of your image, you're saying image pull policy always. There have been a lot of wasted hours on my part because ran the plugin, fixed the bug, found a bug, fixed it, and just didn't seem like the fix was working. And I was driving myself crazy. I would add trace lines, couldn't see the trace lines, couldn't see this. And it was just because it was seeing that image already on the node and not even bothering to pull the fix. So, and then you can also get pod logs. By default, Sonobuoy will get the pod logs from Sonobuoy namespace itself. Those are important. You can definitely see what the aggregator, that's what these are. It's just all the aggregator logs right now. But you can also see inside of Kube's system, by default, we get that. You can tell us not to. But if you are having a problem, like scheduling a node or scheduling a pod and you're getting timeout errors, those are really frustrating because it just says timeout, like expected this pod to be there, timeout. There's no other debug information that the EDE test, for instance, are going to give you. But you can go into the scheduler and look at the logs, or you can go into the API server and check maybe why you got a 403 or a 404 or something like that. So super, super useful when you're actually running debug stuff. If you think the cluster's broken, or if you're just in CI and you really want to be able to deep dive into these failures when they come up. We used to not get Kube system, and honestly, that's one of my favorite tiny additions. Then the last thing I'll point out that we get all this API information from the cluster. So we just crawl the whole API. We just get all that JSON data about the objects. So, you can look at the files here. They're named API services or the component statuses, the namespaces, the nodes. And then in the namespace, you can see the namespace objects too. So you can see then if you're having an error with a pod, you can check the pod status. You can actually look at what the API would look like. And that's because it may not exist later. It maybe gets cleaned up. Maybe the cluster doesn't even exist. To debug, you need this kind of information. And that's the power of Sonobuoy, I think, that we get this stuff automatically and we integrate. We're so easy to integrate with all these different systems. Okay, so yeah, then you just go from here and you add whatever tests you want. You have access to a client. You're automatically getting namespaces. You're automatically sending results to Sonobuoy. Kind of got all the things, and you just start writing your code, right? And I just copied the code over there. That's how that worked. So I think it's a really nice way to get set up, and especially if you're writing POCs or something like that. Don't waste your time writing, the Docker file from scratch and a build script from scratch and a plugin definition from scratch. Just copy all that. We're trying to make it easier because we would love for people to make more plugins. Speaking of, I'm going to open up the strategy document. I'm going to hand it over to Eleanor if she wants to talk a little bit about the strategy.
Unmuting myself. And we see the endless screen there for you.
Oh yeah, here. Let me go back. I wanted to watch you describe everything, but I'm going to have to keep it on here. I have to figure out how to do that another time.
The point merely, yes. I'll what I'm talking through, you can find on the sonobuoy.io website. You can also get to it from the GitHub. The short of it is that as I hinted, when I came on the project, we had Conformance working so well, so stably. There's a lot of trust in the community for Sonobuoy, which is really incredible. And there was the start of some additional plugins, or really all the architectural work was done to allow Sonobuoy to run other plugins. And there had been some plugins like a cluster inventory plugin and a CIS benchmark plugin and other plugins. Yet it felt like folks didn't really know that. So our strategy, the more we thought about it, it feels like, so for non-Kubernetes cluster testing, it's very common to write automated tests. If you want to make sure that your app works, you write an automated test to kind of validate that your app is working in a certain situation. But what we saw is that right now, so much Kubernetes validation is still done manually, usually by Kubernetes experts. Some examples we give, if you need to do a security audit, much of it will be manual. Or if you have a backup admin restoring something to a Kubernetes cluster, they're going to probably have to manually test it after the restore to make sure that it all went well. A support engineer might have to manually run some tests or maybe use a customized script, and it makes it, and then lastly, if you're installing just a complicated tool, maybe Knative or some other installation, first you want to make sure that you have what you need in the system to do that installation, and then afterwards you might want to validate that you've installed it correctly. So all these things are examples of where you could have a Kubernetes expert manually testing it, or you could use Sonobuoy to automate and run cluster validations. So basically, I mean, in a way, it feels like we have two parts. One is we want to get the word out there. We see so much potential for this. So we're hoping that if folks hear how easy we're trying to make it and how interested we are in iterating and improving the experience, we're just hoping we'll see a big explosion of these plugins being created. John, we're very responsive on the Sonobuoy Kubernetes Slack channel. So come see us there if you have any questions about this. John already has heard, folks have seen this. John's heard, oh, this is great, but could you tweak this one little thing? And usually John is totally happy to do that. So yeah, in short, be in touch. And I had one last thing to say, but I'm sorry, it's late my time. Let me think.
Oh, that's okay.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Anyways, jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned the plugins and hoping for more. I had mentioned I would come back to this at some point. VMware Tanzu / Sonobuoy is the main repo, but we have the Sonobuoy plugins repo with a bunch of different other plugins you can take a look at. They're in various states of maturity or support. So hey, if you find a bug, submit a patch. We'd love that. But some of them are useful by themselves or useful as ideas for what you can do and how you can do it. So there's a bunch of tools that already exist out in the world for Kubernetes. Whocan was one of those. And Bridget had done this, and you can see like she's just using the Whocan binary. It's a tool that checks based on Kubernetes policy and like the RBAC policy, who can list resources of different types or things to that extent. And but she just containerized it. She scripted effectively what data she wants and then put it into this plugin. That way anybody, she could just say, hey, run this YAML file. And then all of a sudden you just get all that output for free. And all you would really have to do on your end, if you're already set up for like the EDE test, you would just have to also add, who can. Or you can run multiple plugins. So you can run the EDE plugin and Whocan, and you can run your other custom tests, that sort of thing. All you have to do is just keep adding those plugins and make sure that YAML is available. What are some of these ones we have? We have Kube Hunter. So that's a security plugin from Aqua Security. Again, I think they even have the image already made. That's why there's not a lot in here. So we took their open source repo, I think, and just built it. And that's why it's in the Sonobuoy repository here, or registry. But really, it's all their open source code. Then we just say, okay, run it and send this report to Sonobuoy. What's some other ones?
Actually, one I've always liked. Oh, sorry,
you
go first. No, there's a question in the chat. Awesome question, but you can finish your thought on this, then we'll go to the question.
I was just going to say, in the Slack channel, someone was just mentioning, we put it in this examples because they're really kind of like minimal plugins. They were really supposed to be more inspiration. But this command runner, I made this one so long ago because I kept getting the question of like, oh, could you do this or could you do that? So I made this in like an afternoon to point out, you can do anything. Just put it in a container. And what's funny about this one, it's just a bash script. And what it does is it takes each like argument as a command, runs the command on the shell, saves the output to a file, and then like keeps going. So it doesn't say like pass fail right now, but I made an example here. So like command runner, and I made sure the image had like JQ and kube control in it and stuff like that. So, like echo hello world, kube control cluster info, but you could also do things about like checking the IP status of the node or checking journal config, all sorts of, you just do anything, right? So if you can have, like you were saying, Eleanor, if you could have a Kubernetes expert run their custom script they've developed, you can put it into a plugin, and then it's way easier to pass around and know, like it's very standardized, how to put it in your CI, how to get the data out of it. But yeah, so somebody expressed interest in this one, and it made me smile.
And again, the idea is, you have this Kubernetes expert, they're already doing something. Why not automate what they do? You get to use their time on something maybe more specialized, and then the script is more reliable. It doesn't matter if they're sleepy or not.
Yeah.
Alex asked a really great question about whether we're working with open source teams or commercial companies to have them develop plugins. So our strategy on this is we're both at VMware. So there's enough VMware teams that are excited to kind of do things like this. I think I mentioned the support team. We're working with our support team to do like a support diagnostic tool. And we're thinking of trying to do like a post restore kind of confirmation that some of our Tanzu clusters work. So our strategy is kind of the work we're going to do. We're going to basically be using to improve our open source product, and kind of they'll be our for like guinea pigs basically. John and I will learn how to make the best experience for everyone. Again, this will all go in the open source repo. And then once we get just a few more examples based on this automated cluster validation, that's when we're going to like try to do a real publicity, whatever. I don't know
Hmm.
what they say in PR
Oh,
world, and then just advertise. And once we advertise, that's when we'll be really ready to go to other folks and say, look, we already have these working examples. Teams are using them successfully. We think they'll work for you. Yeah, John.
yeah. Speaking of it, it's a good segue into this other plugin that we're starting to make. This requirements check kind of really struggled with the name because this is where I think a lot of other teams or other companies would still find this really useful. And our hope was, so do comment that it's a work in progress. We're trying to make this like a library of really
Yes.
useful things that anybody might want to check. And the kind of the inspiration for this was Eleanor had mentioned different products have a whole bunch of checks, maybe before or after you install something. And yes, you could have a Kubernetes expert check it manually. That's like the lowest level. We don't want you to do that, but maybe you run it automatically. But you still had to, somebody at some point had to write it, and it was probably manual. We're trying to write all of those little bits that you might want to check into this library so that you can just say things like, well, I need this version of this tool to at least be this, right? I need at least version 1.2 of foo. And I also want to make sure that I have 3 nodes and I have at least this much memory. And, just take that list of things you want to check. They can be in logs, they can be in the API data, whatever it is. If we put those kind of common checks in here, then it is a lot easier for like building blocks for people to make their own plugin in their testing, right? That skeleton I showed you is great because it has a lot of the boilerplate done for you. But as far as actually running checks, you do still have to go and get the pod, and you still have to go and check what the version is manually and know the field for it. So this is kind of that last step of trying to make whatever check you want to run even easier to do so that you can just kind of plug and play. Your test is just say, hey, yeah, use this one for me, use this one for me. I need 4 instead of 3 nodes, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And because already like it's so the most of the plugins were created, I think before we were saying, how can we make it as easy as possible? There was some of that, I think. Then John made his EDE skeleton, which now that's what we're going to use with the VMware teams, and anyone who wants to now, who wants to be kind of more of an alpha tester, we'll do that. But then as we see these alpha testers making these plugins, exactly as John's saying, we want to pull out those common components, make it as easy as possible. And I'd love to see everyone in the Kubernetes community using Sonobuoy to do checks. To build on, by the way, those common components, as John said, it might be a version check, but imagine even like knowing whether there's a load balancer in your cluster. From what I understand, it's quite complicated to check conclusively whether there's a load balancer, maybe check all the different kinds of load balancer. It would be pretty cool to have kind of a check you can just kind of put in with one line or minimal boilerplate.
Yeah, like what functionality? I need this, I need that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One
Oh,
little
you
shout
go.
out
Yeah.
too. Yeah, I wanted to just mention Windows as well. I don't know how many people in the chat might be concerned about Windows. The Kubernetes testing of Windows was always kind of difficult. There's a whole repo about how they test it. And again, Sonobuoy tried to make those steps as trivial as possible, right? Try to front load all the difficult stuff. And so you can run the E2E plugin or the Kubernetes end-to-end tests against Windows nodes. There's a blog post on it on the Sonobuoy site. And we kind of go through like how we built this and what complications there are and why running on Windows is different. But yeah, if Windows is something that interests you, know that Sonobuoy supports that as well.
Uh, And another support question, but a different kind. Someone asked about OpenShift, if Sonobuoy will run on OpenShift. I think the answer is yes, even
Yeah.
though we are both at VMware, Sonobuoy is open source, not VMware or Tanzu specific. So John, I'll let you go the final yes, but as far as we know, it runs on
Yeah.
OpenShift, right?
Yeah, I don't know of any reason why it wouldn't run on any Kubernetes platform. Especially, I mean, let's look at the conformance code. I'm assuming, I'm going to assume OpenShift is conformant. Let's see. IBM
There you go.
OpenShift. So it's conformant. Let's see how they ran it. Oh, see, they have their own little tool how they run it. But yeah, if it's a conformant cluster, then you can run Sonobuoy.
And keep in mind, John, what you're looking at is like users don't have to run it the way you're showing it, right? This is just a fun thing
No,
to see how they check conformance. Like a user can go in and follow the normal Sonobuoy documentation.
absolutely. Yeah. So
Okay.
this is just means like, because each one of these companies that submits their results to the CNCF, they have their own testing pipeline, their own engineer preferences, or they develop their own tools for a multitude of reasons. Maybe someone just had more experience in one area or another, and they didn't mind writing their own tool, or they already had it for some other reason. So yeah, you can flip through here if you're curious. It's also just kind of neat to see who is conformant for different versions. But yeah, if it is a conformant cluster, it will run Sonobuoy just fine, right? We're really just running containers. That's all we're doing. And the aggregator and the worker, they're the same image. They're just running with different commands. There's really no magic sauce that makes it difficult to use. The value of it is just trying to standardize these things so that the bits talk to each other in the same way, so that it's easy to plug into CI, or it's easy to run locally. It's easy to script off of. That's kind of the goal.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna cut off that. All right, I think we've done it. Are there any other questions about Sonobuoy, or where it can run or what it can do? Happy to take any other questions. In the meantime, I'm glad that I can actually look at the screen and see the chat now.
Well, and I'll just say a last plug. The easiest place to find us, I was just going to check to make sure I have the narrative, but the Sonobuoy, yes, it is the Sonobuoy channel on Slack, on Kubernetes Slack. So we're delighted to field any questions there, comments, feedback.
Yeah, and in the Sonobuoy GitHub, people make issues with questions all the time. That's not a problem. I'll get to you there for sure. I go through that pretty much every day. And yeah, we'll try and help you, even if it's not per se a Sonobuoy issue. I remember somebody was trying to run a Windows cluster through AWS, and they were having a problem. Right. It ended up just being a cluster problem, right? But it wasn't a Sonobuoy problem. But I still tried to make sure, because if there is a problem, if Sonobuoy can't run in this situation, we would love to be the first ones to know about it. So tell us you have a problem. If eventually it gets kicked back and says, oh, the cluster's broken because of this, that's great. And you got help, and we got an early detection of a problem. So thank you, Vlad.
Yeah,
All right.
thanks, Vlad.
Well, with that, I think we'll close it out, unless you have anything else to close with, Eleanor. I
I have
appreciate
nothing
you.
else. Oh,
I that's
you go first.
I really appreciate you writing Copilot. This was my first time hosting TGIK, and so got over the nerves and just showed off Sonobuoy. I hope it was a good demonstration, and I hope you think about Sonobuoy next time you want to run your tests.
Yeah.
Bye,
And I'll
everybody.
just say it was a pleasure being a co-host, or whatever I am, a participant. And thanks everyone for being here. It looks like at least one person found the demo useful, so that's fantastic.
Thank y'all. You guys have a good day and be safe.
Take care. Bye. Have a good weekend.